I've been talking a lot about the cognitive turn and the influence of schema-theoretic notions and constructivism in redefining the whole notion of meaning making. I've tried to stress the extent to which readers bring meaning to the page. It's not something they just simply derive from the page. They use the cues provided by the text to construct meaning for themselves. They're like creators, composers, as they take ideas and pull it together in ways that make sense to them. This background knowledge variable turns out to be huge. Indeed, in a lot of research on reading comprehension up until the cognitive turn, most people were finding that a key variable in predicting whether or not a person understood a passage was vocabulary. I think vocabulary was, in a sense, a surrogate for background knowledge. But indeed, if you're looking for the best predictor of whether or not a person's going to understand anything, it's going to be their background knowledge. It displaces vocabulary, displaces their ability to pronounce the words. It's certainly the best predictor over and over again for reading and understanding any passage. And as I showed you in the passage taken from Al Collins, the Collins, Brown and Larkin article, The Window Text, you for yourself, you got a little bit of an experience of how your schema, your sense of how things might pull together in a plausible, coherent fashion, become the standards by which a reader, as he reads, engages in meaning making, pulling together ideas so that they make sense. I think we're constantly doing that in our world. As we take one step forward, as we walk through a new door, we're quickly trying to discern how things are operating in relationship to one another. Well, what becomes very interesting related to that is that whereas some people might have predicted that one could determine a person's ability to read based upon their intelligence, indeed, I think I could show you quite easily that I could make a person who might consider themselves to be an excellent reader to have the sense of being a poor reader. Simply by using what we know about background knowledge. I can create a text which a person will find difficult to understand. And by understand, I think it becomes important to sort of begin to sort of ask yourself, well, what do you mean when you say understand a text? Well, let me show you what I'm trying to say through the reading of a text which I've got on the board here, which is one that I used in a study with David Hayes or Jack Hayes, where we're looking at the influence of analogies upon ability to understand material that we consider to be likely to be unknown to somebody. This is a passage taken out of, that I wrote, actually based upon newspapers' accounts, and so I call it RT News. And it's like one of those little columns you get in the section of sports, catching you up on a sporting event. So imagine there are test matches going on, as there have been recently going on between India and Australia, and you get this short little clip. It almost has a Twitter-like quality to it. Well, today's cricket, the bowlers place their men in slips and covers, but to no avail. The batsman hit 1 4 after another, along with an occasional 6. Well, what's interesting is when I've shared this passage, particularly with people who aren't out of countries where cricket's a very popular sport, or particularly with people who might not know much about cricket, I find I can ask some questions about this passage, like where do the bowlers place their men and what do the batsmen hit? And they can look like pretty good comprehenders. But in reality, I doubt that they have an understanding of what's going on in here. They might not have seen a cricket oval. They might not have realised that in the game of cricket, things like slips and covers are positions on the field. Comparing it with baseball, it would be like let's say a shortstop or other sorts of positions. However, when they start to bring their understanding of the world, again, it may be baseball and the positions on the field, and they recognise the bowler as like a batsman in baseball, and the batsman is like a batsman in baseball. The bowlers are like a pitcher in baseball. They begin to be able to access, by activating their schema, they're being able to access the schema that they might need to understand it. When they begin to quickly realise that, well, a 4 is not unlike a ball that hits the boundary in the baseball, and a 6 is actually like a home run, that they start to begin to get a more of a visual understanding of the game. You can start to sort of see how powerful that one's background knowledge is to understanding their world. I mean, and you know, it's like somebody who knows a lot about plants or trees, and they're taking you for a walk in the woods. They introduce you to things by which you can actually begin to identify and make sense of a world in quite elaborate sorts of fashions. Again, what this finding also points out that, wow, reading isn't a matter of translating the text into words by just simple pronouncing. That's not what reading's about. Reading is really about activating one's background knowledge and figuring out how the ideas make sense. And so right there it sort of you begin to realize that, wow, the background knowledge and the activation of it, the accessing it and the instantiation of it for purposes of making meaning are the machines by which meaning making occurs in reading. And it's happening in a way that may be actually counter to the fashion in which teachers might be proceeding in their classroom. Not only might teachers just go ahead and ask a bunch of questions and be fooled by the fact that the kids can answer those questions, instead of opening up the kid for sort of sharing what's going on in a way that enables you to see if in fact they're making the connections that they need to make. But oftentimes teachers also have adopted a sort of a view that comprehension happens in a hierarchical fashion from the literal to the inferential to the interpretive, when indeed one's ability to infer may be crucial to be able to pin down a literal meaning. And so it really challenges that sort of hierarchy, and indeed it questions whether or not teachers should proceed in that sort of literal to inferential to interpretive sort of fashion. It also does, I think, another key thing, and which I talked a little bit about in the window text passage. It basically establishes the fact that a reader is making meaning alongside of other readers. And in a sense, as they're sort of reading this, they're also involved in a form of visualizing, maybe almost to the point of participating. Like, for example, when I read this thing, if I'm a batsman and I have a lot of experience playing cricket, I might actually sort of be reading this from the perspective, okay, I'm the batsman and I'm imagining what the bowlers are doing. So I become very much like an eyewitness participant in reading a text. Too often teachers sort of think that each child will come up with the same meaning, when indeed each child is like a different eyewitness to the textual experiences that they're reading about. And one person might sort of view themselves as, well, they might not ever even become a sort of a person visualizing it. They might sort of dismiss this text, oh, this is about cricket in Australia, I'm not really that interested in it, and dismiss it. Or they might sort of say, well, this is sort of like the game I watched. And so they somewhat position themselves as a spectator. Or they sort of just position it as, well, this is sort of just interesting to see that this is covered in the RT News or the local newspaper type of thing. And so when a teacher's engaging with her students, I think they need to be sensitive to all those types of things. They need to be careful not to do what I think a policeman would want to avoid if they were dealing with eyewitnesses, giving them too much of a lead or imposing upon them their sense of what took place. They're really wanting these people to unfold for you what their meaning-making experiences are like. So this background knowledge thing, I can share with you lots of texts which have sort of demonstrated this effects, cross-cultural texts, where people who may not be from the culture just do not get the same understandings of those folks who are from the culture, and so on. But they begin to sort of lead us to ask one of the most important questions that came out of this stuff. As people's interest sort of shifted to these sorts of issues, to cognitions, we also were confronted with an interesting finding. We were focused on helping kids get a good beginning to their reading, but oftentimes we found as students in schools were getting an emphasis upon reading for meaning, their reading scores would decline. And that was largely because all of a sudden the emphasis in the tests and that was on reading comprehension. But was also tied to the fact that there wasn't so much of a meaning orientation to their to the type of reading education that they were getting. And we started to ask the question, well, how can we actually help students be better comprehenders? How can we actually help them engage their background knowledge? And we knew the sorts of processes that we needed to activate, and they were very consistent with some of the research coming out now, for example, of online meaning making, is what we're trying to get kids involved in as a form of meaning making that's forward looking. You know, when you're online, you're constantly doing what we call forward inferencing. In the reading experience, what you're after kids to do is to be making meaning and, in a sense, making predictions about what's coming next. And so you're trying to activate their meaning making in a sense similar to what people have to do to you watching a TV series, get you caught in so you're so interested in what's going to happen next. Well, that ability to engage one's curiosity and one's interest to be forward inferencing and pulling together ideas together is a key element in cognition. Indeed, one of the early leaders in cognition, Ulrich Neisser, talked about that in his book Cognition and Reality, where he talked how important it was for people to be involved in a form of predicting. Indeed, I think a good measure of whether a person is understanding what they're reading is their ability to make predictions. So we begin to ask the question, going back again, of, well, are there cues here or clues here to what we might begin to do to improve a person's reading comprehension? Now, that might not sound like such a radical question, but it's a hugely radical question at this point in time, because basically up until this point in time, people thought that one's own inherent intellectual abilities were the key antecedent in terms of deciding whether or not a person is going to be a good comprehender. This notion of teaching comprehension, improving comprehension abilities, is basically sort of saying, hey, in a sense, I'm trying to ask myself or explore the possibility of engineering your intelligence. I'm trying to see if, in fact, I can improve your ability to comprehend the material that you're reading. Again, that background knowledge factor is key. But what if there are strategies that I can begin to give you that enhance your ability to read with better comprehension? Some of those strategies might be, okay, getting yourself to ask yourself, well, what background knowledge might I have that can I access, or how can I actually improve my background knowledge? Let me just take a minute and tell a little story related to this in one sense. I was teaching at Harvard University, and I was teaching courses in reading education, and I had a student come to me. She wasn't from education, and she said she wanted me because she heard that I knew some things about reading comprehension, and she was worried that she had some sort of reading problem, maybe dyslexia even. And I said, well, can you share with me what's going on? She says, well, I just got my undergraduate degree in history. And right now I'm thinking to myself, if she's got an undergraduate degree in history, my goodness, she would have had to read widely and deeply. But she said, I said, well, can you tell me more? I said, well, but now I've moved to psychology and I'm dealing with issues of trying to understand people, and I cannot understand what I've read. And it straight away, it was sort of like, I wanted to sort of say, whoa, you know, what's classic about what you're doing here is you've moved out of a field where you've obviously developed understandings and you've gone into deep in things and you've done really well. And then you're moving outside that field to an area for which you haven't really developed those background of experiences. And what I would suggest that she needed to do was to hand in hand with that shift to psychology, is ask herself, what are sort of the experiences that she had or might have that could enhance her background knowledge, so that she's got a reservoir of material that she can actually utilize for purposes of making meaning. It's like the person who, you know, before they write about something, they need to immerse themselves in that topic. So what will become the focus of our next lectures is this concept of enhancing a person's reading comprehension or learning to learn. I've already mentioned this one, but John Flavel, who used to be at Stanford University, wrote a very important article, in a little comment in a footnote of his article, that maybe what we need is a sort of a meta-memory. And what he was getting at there is maybe we need to not just deal with the engaging somebody in comprehension and hoping that as a result of a diet of reading with comprehension, they'll improve their comprehension. But maybe we need to give them meta skills by which we actually provide them strategy development that they can utilize to enhance their comprehension, not just with material for which they might have familiarity, but with material for which they might not have familiarity. Maybe we need to give learners, all of us, those sort of tools. Indeed, I often find at universities myself a little concerned that we don't do much of that very often with our students. Yet we're expecting our students to read with comprehension. We're hoping that they know how to learn. But we often find that their approaches to reading are pretty lame. They'll oftentimes think that if they just read something from beginning to end, or if it's a text for which they're going to be given a test, they might read it several times. They sort of think that reading quickly without pausing, they might not enlist their own questions. Their approach to reading is pretty simplistic and quite the antithesis of what we know might be key things that they could do if they're to connect ideas, if they're to access their background knowledge in a forward-thinking sorts of way. And as you will find out, that there's much we can do to actually improve the comprehension of people and begin to deal with the issue that was happening at this time. If you recall, where oftentimes kids were going through into the 3rd or 4th grade and all of a sudden coming to encounter difficulties as a fact that from the very beginning they weren't really being encouraged to be the composer of meaning, to be involved in a meaning-centered orientation to reading, which focused upon their abilities to make meaning.